Oh, now, can you all hear me, eh? That's good. I might walk back and forth a bit. I tend to do that. So if you stop being able to hear me, say, Mr. Bradford, go back to that part that makes you sound louder.
Excuse me.
Oh, yes.
It really needs to be louder.
Does this help more?
Yeah.
Ah, excellent, good. Actually, I can move this, can't I? That might help me a bit better, so I don't have to look down. You all see me, right? Excellent, good. I might thank you all for giving me such flattery, I suppose. I was not born to this sort of pedigree, so I appreciate it, but I find it sort of strange. For I was born a farmer's son, and God has given me the great opportunity that I might step up to the responsibility, which, truth be told, last court meeting in Plymouth, I told them to stop electing me. I thought it was a great honour to be chosen so many times, and yet I find it, as I can attest, to be a bit of a burden, and so I think we should share both. Would you not agree? They did not. So here I am again, having been re-elected for the third time as governor. But, as you could probably tell by the way that I am attired and the way that I talk, I'm not a royal governor. You understand the difference, right? So Sir Fernando Georges is sitting comfortably back in England. But I will strive to do the best that I'm able to help. And likewise, you mentioned that I may have been here before, which I can say I've been to your part of the world twice. Once when we first arrived, which I'll speak on a little bit more later, but about a year and a half ago, I walked from outer parts of Cape Cod all the way back to Plymouth, which I would not suggest. For my boat got loosed in a storm when we were looking for food, for we've had some lean times, and we were out amongst the natives looking to purchase some in the winter time, and I had to walk back to Plymouth, which made my feet quite bruised, and I would not suggest doing so. But let me go back to my beginning, so that you might understand why I've come to this wonderful country to represent an even more wonderful country, mine. When I was born, after about a year of life, I am told, for I do not recall, my father died. So I was born in a place called Yorkshire. Do any of you know it? God's own country, yeah? The West Riding to be exact. And I was baptized in a place called Austerfield, and I grew up there, first living amongst my grandparents, because when my mother got remarried, I got sent away. And then I had the misfortune of having my grandparents die, and I was sent back to my mother and my stepfather, and she died. And so I had to be sent to live with some uncles. And this was all by about the time I was 8. So as you might expect, my early years were filled with turmoil and chaos, which of course we all know as good Christians is the antithesis of what we should strive for, which is peace and order. And so I was adrift, looking for some place that I might anchor myself. And God be praised, as I grew older, I came upon some very important men, some of which you might have heard of before. Pastor John Robinson, Pastor Richard Clifton, and a man named William Brewster. And God be praised, they are the ones that gave me what I needed when I needed it most. For through them, I did come to know true church and true Christian brotherhood. However, as some of you might know, I know not where it is that you hail from in the past. If any of you have been to England, you probably well know that whilst we are some of the first to have broken ourselves off from the yoke of popery, bearing you no offence if you're Roman Catholic, please take no offence because you're going to hear a lot of things in this talk that you might not like, but we broke ourselves off the Pope for a reason. And unfortunately, King James has not continued the Reformation as much as we would like. And thusly, many of us were persecuted in our own country. As so is often the case with Christians, we had to seek refuge elsewhere. And so for a long time, our church did meet in a place called Scrooby. Have any of you heard of that? It is where it is that Mr. Brewster lived with his family, and he was a steward. And so at night, and in secret on Sabbath day, we would meet, which of course breaks the law. You understand how the law works in England? For those of you that may have not visited, like any good civilized country, there is a law that does dictate upon Sabbath you attend church. And if it is that you are not at church, they will find out eventually, and they will ask for a reason. And if it is that you have not a good reason, be it that you're deathly ill, or you broke your legs and you can't get there, or for whatever reason, you will be fined. And people such as myself, being middle class, we probably will not be martyred. Now, there's been many a person that's been martyred in the Christian faith for the advancement of the proper way, but hopefully it was not people like myself. However, nobody wants to look like a criminal, do they? No one wants to have to pay a fine to lead a good, godly life. And so, eventually, the burden of doing such was so great that our church sought refuge elsewhere, and we went across the Channel to Holland. However, are you familiar with papers to passport? What you might call passport? Those are not easy to obtain, especially if you are viewed as a religious dissident and perhaps an enemy of the state. So we tried to do it in secret. So one of the first times I got to visit other parts of my country was in prison, for we were trying to secret ourselves across the Channel to go to the Low Countries, and we had procured passage with a, at the time, seemingly honest shipmaster who, when the authorities showed up, promptly left with half of us still on the shore, mostly younger sorts like myself and women. And some of the chiefest men stayed behind, and we were put from prison to prison. Do you know where Lincoln is? Or Boston in Lincolnshire? I spent some time there, but nobody wants to jail women. Nobody wants to jail children. And so eventually, we were let go, and we finally found ourselves in Holland. Have any of you ever been to Holland? Yay? So you well know that it is a crazy place, right? I should imagine that when you visited it was not that much different than when I visited. We went to Amsterdam. Did you go to Amsterdam? So you know that there are pretty much no laws in Holland, apparently. And so we resided there for quite a while with our church, but after about 3 or 4 years, we were having problems living there as well, for, again, the aforementioned seeming madness and lack of order, but also one of our pastors, who I didn't mention before, but he started getting involved with some things that we did not think were very good, and so we decided that we would like to split ourselves off to go to a place called Leiden, or Leiden, depending on where you're born. And we got permission to do so, and we travelled there. And it was in Leiden that I had a wonderful thing happen to me. Probably the second most best thing that ever happened to me up to that point. The first being meeting Mr. Robinson. And that was I met Dorothy. And she was a member of a different church, but a similarly minded Reformed church. Oftentimes referred to like the Ancient Brethren. You know, a good Protestant, but slightly different. You'll find that there's lots of Reformed churches in the world, and our preacher often said, do not call yourself anything particular. You are not a Robinsonist, just like a Calvinist is not a Calvinist, like a Lutheran is not a Lutheran, you're Christian. And the Lord does not use every instrument at the same time. And what is a minister but an instrument of the Lord? And how appropriate be it that he has now been away from me for 4 years, that he should say, I would hope that if you were to be separated from me, you would not shut yourself off from the light. And if you were to find a good, godly minister, you would accept him into the fold. For has anyone ever known of a flock of sheep that has done worse for having 2 good shepherds? Nay. So there's nothing wrong with that. But at the time it was also good because we were around so many reformed mindseted people. The problem was we were around all sorts of people. Like I said, they allow everything. So we did not want to raise our children there, which, as some of you may have guessed, the other great thing that happened to me once I married Dorothy was I had a son. So here came the real problem, though, where it was that I was able to obtain a meager amount of work to sustain myself. I was finding it increasingly more difficult to support my wife and to leave anything for my son. For I was burning through the estate that I had to go back to England to get. For once it was I reached the age of majority, for we're moving forward in time now, when I reached 21, I went back to England. And I took my 9 acres and my orchard that my father left me, and I sold it so I could go back to Holland and do what I thought was the right cause, what God wanted me to do. But I was running out of money, and I'm not the only person that felt the same way. Everyone in my church and everyone in all the other Reformed churches were having the same problems, for we were not Dutch. Holland is an overpopulated place, just like England is, just like most places are, and so all the good work was going to the burghers, to the Dutch, and we got the rest. So I took up work as a Forsten worker. Do you know what that is? I wove cloth and I sewed cloth. And I wasn't particularly good at it, and I did not have a particular desire to do such, but it gave me a little bit of money, so I did it. But even that was not enough once I had a family. So it was around this time we decided as a church that we should start looking for another place to live. For we do not foresee our future in Holland to be a bright one. This took a long time. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to get a group of people, even as small as this, and I would say that our church numbered around 200 people at the time, to ever agree on any one thing. It took 3 years of planning to figure out that we were going to end up in America. There were other places that we questioned, and where exactly in America we would go, we also were questioning. But all the while, we knew this is where we had to go, because our children were losing their culture, they were losing their future, and we couldn't go back to England because, well, we weren't allowed there to keep our church. So America was the perfect opportunity, for it is owned by the king, but it's far enough away, and he is an intelligent enough man to realize we can claim it for him, but we won't be causing no problems with all the other people in England. So he gets rid of us, but he also gets to claim New England as New England, Virginia as Virginia. I know not if you've ever looked at a French map, but they call this region Nova Francais, and they call this New Netherlands on Dutch maps. They probably call it New Spain on Spanish maps. It's when you have people living there that it actually becomes yours. And even then you have to use it, which will come into play, I suppose, later as well. So we looked for a way to get to America. But land is not cheap, is it? Because other than a good, solid, godly foundation, land is probably the best thing you can pass on to your children. Because if you own land, your children will never go hungry as long as you do work. Never is your landlord going to come and say, I'm very sorry, Mr. Bradford, but we're going to have you move over because I got this new flock of sheep that I really need to do pasture on this land, so you're going to have to go live over there. I'm also raising the rent by about 3 shillings. Sorry, because it's his. It's his right to do so, his God-given right. Also, nobody sells land in England. Because even if you're rich, if you're not born with it, you're not going to get it. It's passed down hereditary. If you give away all your land, well, then you're not a gentleman anymore. So people like myself that weren't born to it are never going to get it. So this place, rare opportunity. Never have I heard of a place where so many men could become yeomen, almost overnight. But it doesn't come cheap, because who did I say owns the land? The king. So it's not like we could just show up over here and just start living. That would be trespassing. And that's a sure way to end up in as much trouble as we were trying to leave. So we had to purchase it. And it was right about this time that I ran into a man named Thomas Weston. Have any of you heard of him? I would advise not doing business with him. I mean, not to slander a man, but he proved not to be a great friend, as he said he would be. But he represented a group of like-minded individuals working in London who wished to extend an invitation to join up with us that we might make ourselves into a company. Are you all familiar with stock? Like shares and such? So we were to form ourselves into a joint stock share company that would exist for 7 years. If you work for 7 years, you will be valued at £10, which is the going rate if you want to buy a share, which, if you are to be paid in land, will be valued at 100 acres, as long as you are 16 years or older. Now, if you produce goods and money of your own, you can be valued at a double share, which will then get you 200 acres. That seems like a real good deal, doesn't it? Now, we were informed when we were in Holland that we would have 2 days that we might work upon our own homesteads, that we might prepare ourselves for the furtherance of our lives here in this wonderful country. And it was not until I arrived in Southampton to meet up with the other ship that we were informed, well, actually, Mr. Bradford, it is that we will be working 6 days for the company, and so, of course, that means no days for ourselves, for we all know that nobody works on Sabbath. So our hopes and dreams for getting a head start on our future were quelched right there, like nothing but clouds, castles, blown away. But what are you going to do? You're already on the ship. We already put so much effort, 3 years' worth of preparation and money. You're not going to back out then, are you? So we went ahead of it. Now, have any of you heard of the ship called Mayflower? Have any of you heard the ship called Speedwell? Yeah, so you know what happened on Speedwell, right? Abysmal failure. None of you are related to Robert Cushman, are you? Oh, I didn't want to cause you offense. Mr. Cushman is a great man, but ship building and ship purchasing are not numbered amongst his skills, I think, for he was the agent that did purchase the Speedwell to be our vessel. Now, do you think people send you across the ocean out of the goodness of their own heart? No, I'd like to think that they would, but they do not. And thusly, we had a job to do. It was not merely that we would come and spread our faith and come and live a good life. It was come, catch fish, send them back, make us money, which there's no shame in doing well in the world, as long as you do it in a good Christian way. One would hope that this country might be one where profit and religion can jump together. That was our hope. However, since the Speedwell almost sank twice, we abandoned it on the second failed attempt in a place called Plymouth in England, after they had repaired and trimmed her sail, supposedly, at least once. Now, do you know what overmasting is? Are any of you sailors? To put it plainly, it is something that happens when there's too much sail, which causes too much strain upon the shrouds, which are the ropes that attach to the sail, which then in turn pulls up the hull, which is like unto a barrel, which causes water to come in. Now, it can happen accidentally. Accidents don't necessarily happen the same way twice, right in a row, do they? So I will not speak illy of anybody, but I've heard rumorings, and mayhaps there's verification if any of you come from England, but Speedwell's doing fine. So mayhaps it was Mr. Reynolds that was at fault and not our ship. We did pay them before we left. But that's neither here nor there. Needless to say, we abandoned it and we crammed ourselves into a ship called Mayflower. Now, have any of you been on a ship? It's miserable, right? Worst experience of your life? Oh, yeah. I mean, we stayed in the 'tween decks. And so we were sitting in a space that was designed to hold barrels. And as we all well know, barrels do not breathe in the same way that we do. Barrels do not see. Barrels do not relieve themselves. And they're not very tall. So the space that we were in was not designed for any of those. It was dark, it was dank, it smelled bad, and after about a week I was ready to get off. But the ship is not going to turn around because Mr. Bradford decides he doesn't want to do this anymore. So we suffered in silence, or we suffered loudly. Every baby is a blessing, right? A little less so in the middle of the Atlantic. For at least I did not have the misfortune of bringing my wife with child. Mr. Hopkins, who I now well know, probably going to live that above his head for the rest of his life, I think, because his wife gave birth in the middle of the Atlantic, a babe called Oceanus. But that was loud, and it continued to be loud for the rest of the trip. And there were animals, and there were storms, something fierce. A man fell overboard, and yet by the grace of God, he was pulled back in. And there was a great sundering of the ship, and it was that one of the beams cracked. And again I thought it was that we might reside with Poseidon. And yet God looked after us, for we had brought a screw. You know a screw? 'Tis like unto what you lift heavy things with. Like a jack, some people call it. And so we used that to put it into place. And we went through such trials and tribulations and beatings and batterings, and yet, through the grace of God, we did arrive to the shores of Cape Cod in this month, near unto this day, a little bit earlier. And it was one of the more joyous sights I've seen, land. And it was only upon making landfall that I realized, well, it's not that joyous of a place. I mean, you no offense, but Cape Cod's rather desolate. I've never seen trees go all the way up to the shore. In fact, I've never seen trees this big either. I've encountered, and I'm certain you've probably encountered, be it that you're from here, trees so large that 5 or 6 of us could stand around it and barely touch our fingers together, which is a waste. What use is a tree that big? What are you going to do with it? You can't cut that down. You can't drag that out of the way, unless it makes fruit. I mean, a tree is but an opportunity for something better. So, we tried to get where we were supposed to go. Do you know the Hudson River? Do you know what a patent is? Permission. It's almost like a deed to your house. Remember how I told you that we had to purchase land here, right? So we purchased land from the Council of Virginia, which is the northernmost part of Virginia, is right about where the Hudson River is. It has changed a little bit, and when we were leaving England, there was this new council that was being formed called the Council of New England. But we had already set our sails towards this place, so we just didn't worry about it. However, as you probably well know, this coast is rather treacherous, and it's even more treacherous in November. So when we tried to get around Cape Cod, we sort of failed right about where the elbow would be if we were looking on a map. And we had to turn around again, because our ship had been so bruised and battered that we near sunk another time. And yet, again, God pulled us away from that pit. However, that posed a new problem. Where were we going to live? For Christopher Jones, the master of the Mayflower, did so speedily inform us that, well, I'm not waiting until spring to bring you to Virginia. You should probably live here. I think this place is as good as any, so let's find a place so I can get you off my ship and get my lads home. I'd like to be back by Christtide if possible, and I think that's not going to happen now. So we started exploring this place. And we went up towards, again, like onto an arm, near the tip, near the fist, Cape Cod Harbour, a beautiful harbour, might I add, filled with whalefish and cod the size of us, that we might walk all the way across on their backs, so the sailors say. But the land itself doesn't really have anything, except for snow, trees, wolves, eagles, which taste good, and that's about it. And Indians, apparently, natives, but we could not make contact with them. Every time we would be approached, they'd run away. So they'd watch us, they'd abandon their homes, but they would not interact with us. And only later did I find out 'twas because of a shipmaster that come about a few years before we arrived. And that shipmaster did steal a great number of people. And one of those people that he did steal was a man named Tisquantum, who will become important in about a moment's time when I get to that part of my story. But we couldn't make contact. And as we moved down and down, we made numerous explorations looking for a place to live, and all we'd find is wilderness, trees, dreariness, wilderness, trees, cold. And then the cough started, and then the phlegm started to build up. And then it was that on one of the explorations, when I come back, I heard one of the saddest things I've ever heard, which is that Dorothy had died. Apparently, while I was gone, she drowned. Now, I can tell by the way that many of you are dressed, you might be able to swim. Can people swim here? I can't swim. I didn't grow up next to the ocean, but even if you could swim, have any of you gone in the ocean when it's November? And have any of you wore 2, 3 petticoats made of wool? And so I'm told she slipped and sunk like a rock. But I wasn't there when it happened. And that was very devastating. That is the sort of thing that makes you question your faith. And yet, it is those times when your faith is most important. For God will never give you a burden that you cannot bear, even if at the time it seems like it's unbearable. And so that was all I had to get me through, because at that point, people started dying. And not just my wife, but people from a sickness that was overtaking us. For it doth seem that during that exploration and excursions, people were getting sick. It was where we caught our death, was here on Cape Cod. Because we would wade through the ocean, our ship could get about as close as a mile. So every time we wanted to go to shore, we had to get on a boat and then row. And then sometimes we could not bring our boat close to shore, so we'd have to get out and push, or get out and walk, up to our knees sometimes, which at the time felt pretty good, because we'd been living in squalor on the ship. But again, it's deadly, for if you get too wet, and you get too cold, you get sick. And you can't start a fire on a ship. And so, as people started growing weaker, things slowed down, which of course lessened our chances of finding a place. And so on the third exploration, not only that, but we were attacked by Aboriginals, Nauset people, at a place called First Encounter. That's what we call it now. I don't know if you know of that place. And it seems that they'd wish to come beset us in the morning, come and wailing like the devil himself in the woods. It's not a very good way to be woken up, I should imagine. About 40 men screaming at the top of their lungs. And mentioned that my captain, Mr. Moyle Standish, visited you, and he saved my life on that day because he had a snap-ons. Do you know guns? A little bit? Snap-ons uses a flint, so it's faster if you know what you're doing. There's more chance that you'll mess up if you don't. So I had a matchlock, a lot of us did, but he used that snap-ons and his ability as a soldier to defend us while we got ourselves ready. And yet again, as you may have noticed in my tale, God looked after us. And so, nobody was hurt on either side. Had an arrow right through my coat, and yet nobody died, nobody got shot. We scared them away. It was also, during this excursion, that God revealed a little bit to us part of his plan, methinks. Because our pilot, Mr. Copin, who had been to this place before, said, well, if I can't get you to Virginia, I know of a good harbor. It's up north. Let me take you there in the shallop. You know what a shallop is? It's a boat. So we're on the boat, and a great storm did rise up. So much so that the mast of the shallop snapped, and we were adrift once again. And during this time, Mr. Copin did so bravely state, I think I'm lost, and was very afeared, as we all were. We called out to God for relief, and we were brought to an island. which turned out to be in a harbour, which turned out to be what we call Plymouth. So we made landfall on this island, explored it, found it to be not much there, and we hunkered down. And then the next day, being Sabbath, we gave thanks to God for not sinking us, and we spent the day in rest. And on the next day, we did set foot upon Plymouth for the first time. And do you remember when I told you this place looked like? A horrible howling wilderness with trees all the way up to the shore? Well, Plymouth, I will tell you, is a horrible howling wilderness, but the trees don't go all the way up to the shore, because there used to be a place called Pawtuxet. And we found this out through a man named Samoset. And so, what did behold us? Not trees, but fields. Now, they were a bit fallow, and they are cleared in the fashion of the natives, but still fields, clearings, a start. Does that not seem like providence? And so we said, this is where we should live. This is a sign. And so we brought the Mayflower across. And yet there was a great testing again. For God tests those that he loves most, the hardest. That's what keeps you going when things like this happen, because the death did not stop. So even though we got to Plymouth in December, everybody was sick. There were about a handful of people that could even stand up some days. And we were afflicted with a great phlegm of the chest, phlegm in your head, wheezing, coughing, weakness, and it spread to everyone. So if you can barely stand up, you can't build a house. And the crew was just as sick. And so we did the best we could, and the men would go to shore, but it slowed us down. And I remember that we broke ground right about Christtide, and the first winter of our first house. And we built that house in about a week, because nothing motivates a man more than freezing. So it was not a very pretty thing. It was not the most sturdiest of things, but it wasn't a ship. And immediately we started ferrying everybody across, get them off the ship. But some people were so weak, there was nothing that could be done for them. And by the end of January, we had buried about 2 or 3 people a day. So during the course of the first winter, even after we had gotten off of the ship, half the people died. So my friends lost spouses, my friends lost children, children lost their parents, whole families died. The Tinkers, people I knew, no longer. They were with God, hopefully. And everything was slowed by this, but we kept at it, because we knew that this is what we were supposed to do. But that's the sort of thing that will wear down on you, and you just ask for relief. You say, why is it that I've been so forsaken? What did I do? Was this wrong? Was I not supposed to come here? And then, as the weather started improving, as our home started being built, the deaths stopped, at least in such great amounts, and things started to look a little bit better. And while we were on Cape Cod, we had found some corn. Do you know the maize corn? Yeah, it was buried in the ground, which we later found out that's how natives store things, but there was no one there to buy it from. Worry not, I've come back, I've paid them for it, it's fine. 3 times its worth, actually, so we're friends. Yanu, great sachem of the Nosset people in this part. Not to digress. We planted our crops. We started to think about how we were going to plant this Indian corn. And then a man came walking right into town. Now, this is one of them native men. I don't know if you've seen them. They don't wear a lot, but it doesn't seem to affect them, which is, I need my wool. It gets cold here in the wintertime. And so he walked right into town, as bold as can be, not a look of fear in his eye at all. Walked right up to us as we were working, and we all went to go get our guns, and, we'd been shot at before, we had heard horrible tales from other people. And this fellow walks right up into town, looks us straight in the face and says, "Hail, Englishman. How are you? Do you want to trade? Do you have anything to eat? Drink?" beer, biscuit, butter, in perfect English. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better than I would have ever imagined that I would meet a native man to speak to. Now, I had heard of native people before, but I assumed that they would speak their language. Does that not seem like providence? Does that not seem like a sign from God? So you've been suffering, but here is a gift for your faith and goodness. An Indian that speaks English. There you go. And, better yet, he got us into contact with another man, Squanto. Not only did Squanto speak very good English, especially for a native man, honestly better than some of the other people I've felt in my country, he lived in London for 3 years, because you remember there was people that come here before. And again, just another showing of providence. God did pluck him up from his own country as a slave, and yet take him to where he needed to be, like Joseph. And yet, he was freed from the burden of slave, lived in London, met these people that were very important in Cornhill, Mr. Slade, the governor of New England himself, got shipping back to New England to find that everyone that had lived where he was had died of plague. So God had spared him the plague by removing him, and then who should show up to be his new family, to be his new neighbors, but us, who he had just spent 3 years learning how to talk to and how to understand. God gave him such an opportunity. So again, it was another showing of, I think this is where we're supposed to be. So we continued on with increased vigor and spirits. And then it was that, as is so often the way of life, is it not that God made sure we weren't too bold and too secure, because you always got to have that healthy fear of God. And Mr. Carver was taken from us. John Carver was our deacon and my predecessor as governor. And if I should ever manage to be half as good as him, I should consider myself a fortunate man. And I should consider the town of Plymouth to be a fortunate town to have someone even half as good as Mr. Carver. For he could take this group of people who didn't even know each other. And speaking of those people that Mr. Weston brought with us, names like Billington, Hopkins, Standish himself was not a member of our church. And us, a close-knit group of good-minded Reformed Christian people who are viewed by these people as criminals, and make them work together. For when we were on Cape Cod, for instance, because some of you may have figured out, well, Mr. Bradford, if you're living in New England, didn't you buy land in Virginia? And a lot of other people figured that out as well, and they said, well, maybe we don't have to do what we agreed to. Maybe I'm just going to go build a house. And a lot of you can be off, and I don't really care. And so, we formed up this document, which you might have heard of. You heard of, like, the Mayflower Compact? That is a patent without all the lawyer talk. Meaning, no offense if any of you are lawyers, but they tend to be very verbose. It takes 5 pages to say something that really only 1 page needs to be said. And so we made our own patent, which essentially said we'd elect people like myself, and we keep a civil body politic because we ain't got no gentlemen. But Mr. Carver was instrumental in that. I helped, as did some of the other men. So, we carried on despite the great blow. We gave him the greatest honor that we could, and then his wife died. He was taken in the field. The sun in this country is so hot it can kill a man, which I suppose you probably know, but I would advise you all to get a good hat. And Mr. Carver was working so hard that he was overtaken with the heat, methinks, and he was taken by us. And then his wife died of a broken heart. She was always sort of weak after the first sickness, never really recovered. And so then I was made governor when I was on my deathbed. Well, apparently, obviously I'm not, because I'm talking to you right now, but I was stricken with a great pain to my hucklebone. Do you know what a hucklebone is? It's your hip, somewhere around there. Because, and I will sort of admit, because I like to be a humble man and not have too much pride, but sort of embarrassingly, I ended up in a deer snare when I was in this part of your country as well. The natives set snares for deer, apparently, and if you're not paying attention, they can catch governors. So when we were out on Cape Cod, I ended up, sort of on my bottom with my legs up in the air, and honestly, I thought I was going to die then because I think it pulled my leg out. And we were out in the middle of nowhere, so I sort of had to put it back in place and walk back, walk it off, as they say. And it's afflicted me ever since. I've felt that pain, usually when the weather changes. But that was the first time that I actually felt it in earnest, and I fell down in the field when I was working, and everyone thought I was going to die. And yet, obviously I didn't, but they elected me and a man named Isaac Allerton, one of my most trusted partners. He's been my assistant for all the years that I've been governor. Much better with mathematics than I am, and a gifted, intelligent, educated man, also a member of our church. And so that was when I became governor for the first time, which, as I alluded to before, has not been the last time, and hopefully soon they'll elect somebody else. Because, as I told you, I am not of that pedigree. So we lived, we farmed. Squanto helped us greatly. He did teach us the ways of the Indian when it comes to native corn, because as it turns out, wheat, barley, rye, peas, at least in the beginning, have not really been worth the effort to plant. But this maize corn grows wonderfully. I put one seed in the ground, I'll get 200 in return. So that's what we grow. Do you know what a herring fish is? And alewives and things? Well, see, these Indians, they don't keep livestock, which we found out, and they don't build fences either. But they don't got no droppings. They don't have manure, right? Well, how are they going to manure their fields? They use fish. Let it never be said that the natives are not clever. They make do with what they have excellently. So we bury the fish now, just like they do. Got through that first year, and I decided that we should have a day that we might in a more special manner rejoice together. And so, after the first harvest, which proved to be little better than meager, but sufficient, I called for a day that we might celebrate. Now, before Mr. Carver died, one of the greatest things that he did was broker a peace betwixt our people and what's called the Pokanoket people. Have you heard of Massasoit? The Massasoit Osamiquim? Great friend to me and to our town. He is the emperor of the Indians in this area. So if you don't know him, you should probably recognize the name here on out, there's a lot of them. And we have upheld that contract ever since. And part of the agreement was we shall protect each other militarily, we shall protect each other economically with trade, and we shall give, our criminals to each other and make certain that no one offends the other, and generally be amicable neighbors. Keep that in mind, because some of the things that English people do, and I imagine it's the same with any people that have guns, when they are happy and they have guns, they shoot their guns. And so when I called this day that we might celebrate, people started exercising their arms. You've all been to a parade, right? What does that look like? So everyone was marching around, shooting our guns at targets, shooting our guns in the air, waving our banners. And who did show up but Massasoit and 90 warriors ready to help us, because they thought we were fighting someone. Because apparently they don't do that. So we had to sort of say, oh, my apologies, we are not under attack. In truth, we are celebrating. Would you care to join us? And so he accepted, and this is only polite when you bring 90 uninvited guests. He went out and got some food, and actually bestowed upon us a great honor, venison. Have any of you eaten venison? Yes, because you live here. If I put venison on my table back in England, I'd end up with a longer neck. It's illegal, it's poaching. Don't do that. All the things I can eat here are amazing. And so he gave us about $5. So that in itself is a great honor. That's what kings give to other kings. So I was rather humbled by that. But they stayed for 3 days, and we feasted together. And it was a fairly joyous time with what had been a fairly unpleasant year. And I do believe you make note of that, as such as a Thanksgiving, yeah? But I don't call that Thanksgiving. For in my church, I feel that Thanksgiving is a day of solemn prayer where you usually fast, and it only happens when necessary. For instance, when I had my first son, we had a day of Thanksgiving. And we've had a day of Thanksgiving in Plymouth when we were relieved of a drought last year. But that we just call a harvest festival, I suppose. Because every once in a while, it's quite fine to be a little bit merry. Now, you may have heard things about me, that I don't like merriment. I think everything is fine in its moderation. So that is how what you call Thanksgiving, I suppose, came to be. Now, I've sort of gone on to perhaps the point of tedium. I know not. My wife often says I can do that. I was curious if any of you have anything in particular that you're curious yourselves about. Because I can talk about pretty much anything, and I can go on for pretty much ever. So, before I continue going, I thought maybe I'd ask you if there's any questions about literally anything. Yes?
So who is your second wife and how many children?
Yes. I just do this, otherwise then I'll lose my voice and you won't be able to hear anything. God did bless me with another woman who was, while not the first love of my life, has proved to be equally wonderful. And her name is Alice. And we got married last year, so in 1623. And with her marriage comes 2 stepsons. So at present, we have been blessed with one of our own. I have a son, John, with Dorothy, as you know, who I left behind in England because I didn't want to bring him to suffer, which was it's one of the biggest arguments we've had, I suppose, when I was with Dorothy, was what we would do with John. But we ultimately decided to leave him behind. And so now I have 2 stepsons and 2 of my own sons, but only one lives in the country. And I knew her because our families were friends when we lived in Holland. Her first husband, Edward Southworth, was a very important man in our church, in that he was a good friend and a good supporter. And so we were friendly to one another, but, as just friends. But I thought, when I heard that her husband had died, and I had been a widower for so long, and really did not wish to walk through life again in such a way for so long, especially being the governor, I wrote to her, and I asked if she would wish to get married. And of course, she had the whole Atlantic to avoid awkwardness, and she agreed. So she came across, and actually that was the only other time in my recollection in these 4 years that we've actually celebrated with the Indians. For another great honor was bestowed upon me because the king himself, Massasoit, came to my wedding. And so he brought, this time not as great number of warriors, he brought women as well, families. And we did reaffirm our contract with each other, but also we celebrated again for about another few days. So yeah, I've been blessed many times to know many great women and many great men. The sorts that you might only get to meet 1 or 2 usually, and hopefully, being a young man, I'll get to meet even more. Yes?
I know most of you were farmers. You were not used to being near the sea. Did you end up going fishing very often?
So I told you that we're supposed to be a fishing colony, right? Now it is not for want of trying. Let not our dissenters persuade you. We work, and we fish, and we've gotten good at it, I would say humbly. It's other things that keep us from making a profit. Now, I never eaten fresh cod till I moved here, and let me tell you, it's a lot better than the salted stuff. I love it. You ever had mackerel? Yeah? Even the low sort of fish are good here. You ever eaten like lobster? Yeah, it's pig food in this country, but it's so easy to get. So the mussels, the clamps, The lobsters, usually we let our hogs dine on it, but during that second winter when we were starving, sometimes if you were to come to my house, all I'd be able to offer you is a cup of water from a spring and maybe a lobster. Now you might like lobster's taste, but try eating it for a month and nothing else. You'll feel like you're dying, especially if you do field work. So we eat a lot of fish. Summer into autumn is fish time. And as the fish decrease, the fallow increases. I mean, I could fill a volume with the number of wild birds and wild fish that we can eat. And again, there's no restrictions in this country. I've eaten swans, cranes, conies, you know what a coney is? Rabbits. I mean, in England, in some places, they're protected because the gentlemen like to chase them with their dogs, for sport. You ever eaten an eagle? Not that discernible from mutton if you salt it right. I suggest it. There are not really any eagles in England. There are no wolves in England because they're vermin. They don't do anything. They'll eat your kids. Not your children, but your goats. And so we eat lots of fish, we catch lots of fish, but it seems that God has a great intent to fill our bellies, but not our pockets by way of fishing. Because every time it seems that we are about to get a profit, something happens. And I'm not complaining, because you're not supposed to complain, but first ship, the Mayflower that we sent back, because remember, it's not our ship, we merely hired it, empty. Which, of course, the first letter I ever received as governor was addressed to Mr. Carver, for one, because I didn't know he died, and it was just filled with complaints. And I thank God that it takes so long to write a letter. Because if I had been able to do it instantly, I probably would have gotten in a lot of trouble. I was a little heated. But at least the time of writing did temper my response. The second ship we made certain to fill with all sorts of goods. I'd say about £500 worth of profit, which I can say is no short amount. And it was taken by the French right before it reached England. And they took all the goods, ransomed the crew, so there goes a big loss. Now, mind you, you need a ship to be a fairly productive and effective fishing colony. So we have boats, but we did not have a ship. Now, I know not very many shipmasters that will say, "Shipmaster, I've got the deal for you. How about you take 8 barrels of your fish off of your ship and put 8 barrels of our fish on your ship and don't mark it up at all?" No, no one does that. So it's real expensive to ship our fish on other people's fishing vessels. And God was very kind. And we finally got another ship, thanks to our investors. And it came across, and it was very productive, but the crew was miserable. Drunks. They set fire to part of my town. They didn't want to work. They wanted to be privateers and pirates. And I had to renegotiate their contracts. They go up to, do you know where the Main is? Do you know where Damaris Cove? It's up there. And they didn't tie the ship up right, and it sunk. Got a hole about the size a carriage could fit through. And I had to pay every carpenter in New England this year to raise her back up and fix her. So again, another sort of setback in the fishing. But I think they taste good. So yeah, we eat a lot of fish, but we haven't really been very productive yet in terms of money. But to someone like myself, our true purpose is not these things of man, but to further the Christian faith and to leave something to our children. Yay.
I understand you had a great liking for beer.
Oh yeah, we're English, we're weaned onto it. Aren't you? Or are you from Orchard Country and you like cider? Oh yeah, beer is better than water. I will say that the water here is wonderful. Best water I've ever drank. But you know what's better than wonderful water? Beer made from that water. So we make beer, but again, because the barley doesn't grow as well as we'd like, people do not put their trust in barley, and so they don't grow enough to make beer all the year long. So we still go some days with just drinking water, which is one of the problems that they wrote about to these people back home that I have to keep pleased. I mean, being the governor is like being everybody's father. and I don't really want 180 children. So these people have been complaining about all manner of things. Even some of the people in my own church, they say there's too many mosquitoes in the country, there's too many wolves, the ground won't make food. I mean, these people, I think, were expecting to come out here, to go upon your point that a lot of these people never farmed before, and go out into the woods like a larder and come back with their food like at a grocer, and that the fountains of the earth would bubble forth with beer and wine, not water. I mean, the complaints I've heard, some of them are legitimate, but many of them are sort of childish in a way, if you ask me. Yes.
Did anyone stay in Provincetown?
You mean up at the top of Cape Cod? No. I mean, eventually I think this place might prove to be habitable, but I wouldn't want to live here.
I think if I had been a man and I'd landed in Provincetown, after that trip I might have stayed.
Well, yeah, I will say that one of the first things that the women did were beg to be let off the ship so they could bathe and do laundry. And I don't know, I've never heard my wife beg to do laundry ever since I've been married, so it was rather bad. But yeah, I mean, once you got there and every night you heard the howling of wolves to lull you to sleep, and there's nothing, it loses its appeal and the ship feels a little bit more safer even though you're freezing to death. So we all wanted to agree to go to the same place. That's another reason we signed that contract with each other, so that people wouldn't do that. Because together we are strong. Our community is the greatest thing that we have. And yet, alone we'll all die.
They didn't know what could have been worse, what they were going to get into.
Well, that's sort of life, I think. It's always hard, it's always terrible, and you have to have faith that God won't make you suffer too much, and that you're doing the right thing. Any others? Yes?
What kind of feather is in your hat?
I am told it is from a bird called an ostrich. I did not kill it myself. I bought this in Holland. Do you know of the place called Africa? Yeah, a strange place, far away, but there are birds the size of men, they say. And so it comes from that. But it's a mere mild form of ornamentation. Were you saying that it is near on? So, if no one has any other questions like this, are there anybody that has questions for me like this? Yes?
The gunpowder, is that easy to make? Did you all make your own? Or, as you said, just for celebrating, you were just shooting up in the air?
Gunpowder is very hard to make. They did not know how to make gunpowder. So no, it's the sort of thing that they must have very much needed to let off some stress. They would import gunpowder. Pretty much every time a ship would come, they'd try to get more. But it's something that they were unable to make here. That's also why, when John Carver passes away, they make note that they gave him the best honor they could, and they fired guns over his grave. So that's the salute, which is in of itself important. We do that even today. But also the fact that they're shooting off guns when they're surrounded by people that might mean them harm, and they don't know when they're going to get their next shipment of gunpowder. He must have been a very well-liked person. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that Plymouth Colony can't make. So even if you knew how to make gunpowder in England, you weren't making it in America. If you know how to make hats, you're not making it in America. Clothes, I said I was a Faustian worker. I'm not going to make cloth in America. Everybody becomes a farmer, and everybody becomes a fisherman.